I have always thought that I understood Australia as a kind of fellow traveler of the United States, a similar place with decidedly different mammals. I am less and less convinced that I understand Australia on the basis that I see things coming across media, social and otherwise, that suggest a kind of draconian shift in the Australian landscape. And at the same time, although I think I can interpret what I'm seeing and I understand it to be quite frightening, I'm told by people in Australia that I've misunderstood the evidence, that in fact things are quite normal and that I am falling prey to a distortion. So I was hoping that you could help me and my listeners understand what is going on in Australia relative to COVID-19.
Yeah, look, Bret, it's a really good question, and there's a lot to unpack out of all of that, of course. But I've been saying to people for the last few months, the last few years even in Australia, that if you look outside the window in Australia at the moment, you largely see the country, I think, that we had. And we have got, and I'm going to say it, and your listeners won't like it, the greatest country in the world here. And but it is true. We have a lot in common with the United States, and we have a lot of things that are terrific about this country: lifestyle, system of government, natural resources, beaches, you name it, friendly people, all the rest of it. So if you look out the window at the moment in Australia, you still see that. But the difficulty is that what's going on in that subtle space of politics and of public discourse, and of course in our parliaments as well, gives me very, very much the reason for alarm. And I'll explain why. As it stands, we're still very similar. The United States and Australia have a similar but different path, as we know. One of the great differences, I think, though, for Australia is that we were formed in around about the year that you were fighting the American War of Independence. We were found, the first fleet turned up in 1788 in Australia. It was set up as a penal colony. The British used it effectively as a way of parking about 160,000 convicts who were brought out here for the heinous crimes of stealing loaves of bread. But our history is not forged in war and fighting for our freedom like the United States is. And my view is we're seeing the fruit of that now. The United States fought against the British and fought for its freedom. And I think indelibly that's been marked in your founding documents, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and all the things that go with it. Here, we almost, and I've heard it said by learned commentators that it's been said that Australia was a penal colony and has now come back to being a penal colony. I think that's probably a bridge too far. But certainly we were always a country that lived under the spectre of the police, I think, effectively. I mean, that's how Australia was born. A lot of free settlers, and certainly South Australia, here where I am, was a free colony set up by private enterprise. But ultimately, Australia's DNA is one almost of being more compliant and less libertarian, I think, than the United States. And I think that's where the fork in the road has gone. So, as I said, as you look out the window, it all looks normal. But what we're seeing in terms of these protests, particularly coming out of places like Victoria, which is one of our states in the country here down in the southeastern part of the country. It's a very artistic city, a very erudite city. And it's a city that has long had its tradition for academic thought and all the rest of it. And at the moment, it's the city where all of the images of strike-breaking tactics, of police cracking down on protesters, and a lot of the really, really hardcore stuff. It's the city in the world that has had the longest run of lockdowns. This has had 260 days of lockdowns in the last period. Now, that means people locked in their homes. So I guess to answer your question, it's a bit of a mixed message there. The things that are happening in Australia are very real. The things that are happening, even if they're happening once, are very concerning and very frightening. There's a whole host of them, by the way, and we'll discuss a few of them today, I suppose. But certainly, the liberal democracy that is Australia is alive and well. But we have to make sure, I think, here in this country, people like myself and other politicians that feel strongly about this, that we keep talking about the chipping away at the edges of the fabric of this nation, because it's very real and it's very alarming.
Well, I think we've been through a number of rounds of trying to assess what we're seeing in the world. Social media and regular media has a way of putting the most alarming things on a screen, and the challenge always comes back and says you're being misled because you're seeing, where the protest is happening, where the crackdown is happening. You're not seeing all of the normalcy. On the other hand, this bias exists throughout history, right? Even during wartime, most places at most times, there aren't shots being fired. And so we can't reassure ourselves too much. The fact is, the agreement that we have in the West with each other is based on the idea that rights are paramount and that they can only be abridged when a very high bar has been met by government. And I think many of us, myself included, believe that the bar has not been met in this case. And, you joke about Australia being founded as a penal colony and some people suggesting that maybe you've returned there. And on the one hand, I get that maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. On the other hand, I know that today I was looking at yet another video of Michael Gunner, who I guess is in your Northern Territory. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
And he was declaring that for the unvaccinated only, the number of reasons that you are allowed to leave your house is now down from 5 to 3. You're not allowed to go more than 30 kilometers from your house. And this strikes me as both punitive, and I would say it is all but obvious that it is punitive. It is a punishment designed to force people towards vaccination, and it is also extremely restrictive of liberty. So not exactly a penal colony, but the analogy is not that great a stretch.
Yeah, and look, you're quite right. That's a relatively recent development, I think, in Australia, but it's consistent with a whole host of smaller ones that have followed a similar line, and they all centre around this issue about segregation, this development of a two-tier society of people who are vaccinated and people who are not. And it should be said that 90% of Australians, or a little bit more now, have taken that offer up, have taken the vaccines up. So we're a highly vaccinated nation. We were also told by so-called expert modelling, and I one of the things I want to see in 2022 is the use of data modelling and the phrase data modelling less, because it's always met with conjecture, and in this case is true. But we were told the country would get back to normal at 80%. Well, we're up to 90% now, and we're seeing instances like this in the Northern Territory. I mean, this is outrageous behaviour out there. And Michael Gunner is, I think, he's a member of the Labor Party. He's the chief minister from the Labor Party, which is a left-wing major party. And he has made a couple of announcements over the course of the last 6 months in particular. The first one was the statement that it was words to the effect of, I don't care if you say you're not anti-vax, but if you are against vaccine mandates, then you're an anti-vaxxer. So using that pejorative language in order to marginalise. And then yesterday's announcement, which is, as you described it, an announcement whereby the Northern Territory is effectively reinforcing that two-tiered society. It's saying we're going to have a lockdown. That is, people are going to be in their houses, but if you're vaccinated, you're allowed to go about your normal business. If you're not, you can't go more than 30 kilometres away from your house. You can't leave your house unless it's in a medical emergency or to get emergency supplies. We've been saying this. People like myself have been saying this for years now. Show us the evidence that that's a reasonable statement, because I don't think there is any. I'm pretty sure you would agree there isn't any. And we've seen this repeated all across the country. Our state parliaments and our territory governments have been acting on advice they won't show us. And, they have been quite prescriptive in the types of measures that have been brought in to stop people's movement, to require mask mandates, to require vaccine mandates, to lock people in their homes, all based on science that they won't show. And that's part of the reason why I've got myself into trouble, I think, with some of our health bureaucrats, is because I keep asking for it. I say, show us the evidence. Why is it that this is important to have one set of rules for people that have made a health choice and another set of rules for another? And the silence is deafening. Absolutely deafening. Yeah,
it is. And I must tell you, I'm a scientist, and I've looked carefully at this, and it's not that I don't see the noise in the data. I do. But there is nothing conclusive to support the kinds of measures that are being instituted. And I know that as a member of the West, our relationship with rights is fundamental to our societal function. And the idea that bureaucrats, most of them unelected, are in a position to simply look at what they think the evidence is and conclude that, it is the time to suspend our rights and to behave in a way that is most decidedly not consistent with our founding values, is preposterous. I know, as you've just implied, that we need to have a discussion, right? There are circumstances in which one does override liberty, but those are the most sobering of circumstances, and they require us to have an open discussion of what the evidence does imply and whether this is indeed a moment that justifies that. And I know we didn't have that discussion here in the U.S. I'm getting the sense you didn't have it in Australia either, which raises the question, what is this really about? Is it about protecting people from a disease, or is it about enforcing compliance at all costs?